Imagine this. You open your eyes, and the world has changed. It's the year 800. The air smells of hay and cold iron. Your bed is a pile of straw. Your name, if anyone remembers it, hasn't been spoken in weeks. You're not a soldier, not a scholar, just the stable boy, the one who sweeps the stalls, rubs down horses, and eats last, always last. But then, one night, something shifts. A faded letter slips from a crack in the wall, unread. Unsent, still breathing with a promise. A grey mare, long ignored, begins to look at you differently. A gate that once kept things out creaks open without a sound, and in that silence, a question settles. What if the smallest life could carry the quiet weight of history? The boy who named the Mare, a gentle sleep story from the age of Charlemagne. Let it lead you back to where the softest voices still echo. The first whinny before dawn. Have you ever opened your eyes in a place that doesn't yet belong to you? The wood above me was dark, split in places, with spiderwebs catching nothing but dust. The air held its breath heavy with the scent of damp straw, old leather, and something deeper. The kind of smell that only comes from things that live close to the ground. I didn't know what time it was, but I knew it wasn't morning yet. The horses hadn't started moving. Not really, just an occasional shift, the soft scrape of hoof on board, the slow, sleepy pull of breath through their broad noses. I lay still under a wool blanket that scratched more than it warmed. Someone had thrown it over me last night. After my father left, no one told me where to go or what to do. They just pointed to an empty corner between a feed barrel and a broken harness rack and said, "Sleep there." He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. We both knew he wasn't coming back. My breath fogged lightly in the cold. Somewhere far off, a hinge creaked, but inside the store, the quiet pressed close, not cruel, just unfamiliar. I counted the boards above me, 12 across. One had a knot shaped like a teardrop. That's where my eyes stopped. And then, as if someone struck a soft bell in the dark, a sound lifted. A single, sharp whinny. Not fearful, not loud, just clear, awake. It came from the next row of stalls, where I couldn't yet see, but something in it reached me, like the barn itself, whispering, "You're not alone here." That was the first time I let the stillness settle and didn't feel afraid. The light came slowly, not like a sunrise you'd see from a field, golden and warm. No, it crawled in through the cracks of the wooden boards, pale and cold, like someone forgot to invite the sun to this part of the world. You could smell morning before you saw it. Damp earth, stale hay, horse sweat dried into leather, and the faintest whiff of cooked oats coming from far beyond the stables, probably for the men. Not for me. My stomach gave a soft growl. No one noticed. I sat up, my back stiff from sleeping curled in the straw. Bits of it stuck to my shirt and hair. The blanket had twisted itself around my legs during the night, like it was trying to hold me down. There was movement, not just the horses now. Footsteps, low voices. The older stable boys were up. You could tell by the sound of the buckets fast. Confident, metal slapping water. I'd learn that rhythm later. Not yet. A man passed the open stall where I slept. He didn't stop, just tossed something through the opening, a cloth and a tin mug. "Wash. Use the trough. You're on muck duty." No name, no smile, but not unkind. Just the way things were. I took the cloth and stepped out. The early air was sharp and carried the sting of wood smoke. I walked past the rows of horses, each one shifting slightly, their eyes following me like curious monks. And then I saw her, a tall, dapple grey mare, already awake. She didn't snort or shy, just looked straight at me with the calm of someone who'd seen 100 boys just like me and knew which ones stayed. I didn't know it yet, but she'd become the first creature I trusted here, and maybe the first to trust me back. The trough was a stone basin tucked beneath a bent oak. It held water cold as the wind, and twice as stubborn. I dipped the cloth and washed my face, wincing. Dirt ran down my neck, but the sleep stayed lodged behind my eyes. I didn't mind. It made everything feel less like a dream. The muck rake leaned against the barn wall, taller than me, its wood darkened by years of use and sweat. I picked it up the way I'd seen others do, 2 hands. Not too tight. The straw underfoot was damp and clinging. the kind that sticks to your boots like it has something to say. I worked in silence. There was a rhythm to it. Scoop, step, dump, repeat. The horses shifted occasionally, huffing, their breath fogging the morning air. Some watched me. Others ignored me entirely, their way of saying I hadn't earned their notice yet. But the dapple grey mare, she stayed still. Her eyes followed me like lanterns, steady and without judgment. I didn't know her name. Maybe she didn't have one. Names were for those high enough to matter, and I wasn't there yet. Still, something passed between us in that stillness. I'd mucked 3 stalls before she blinked. It felt like a nod. That morning, the work didn't feel like punishment. It felt useful, solid, like I was building something no one could see, not yet. A place in the rhythm, a space in the silence, as the sun finally slipped through the high windows of the barn, warming the dust in slow gold patterns. I found myself thinking, if I'm going to belong anywhere, maybe it's here. Not in a castle, not at a feast, but in a stall, beside a horse who blinked once and stayed. Hooves, hunger, and hierarchy. The second morning felt colder, not by temperature though, the frost still clung to the edge of the feed buckets, but by the way people moved. Quicker, sharper, like the silence of night had been replaced not with noise, but with a quiet that had no room for you. I rose before anyone called. My back ached from straw pressed too long into the floorboards, and my hands were already rough at the edges. I rubbed them together, more out of habit than hope. Outside the stall, the stable came alive not suddenly, but the way a fire takes to damp kindling. A crack here, a hiss there, a faint glow beneath the hay. The older boys moved like they'd always belonged, barefoot on wood, voices low, hands sure. They didn't shout, they didn't smile, and they didn't look at me, not because they were cruel, but because I wasn't worth seeing. Not yet. I watched as one of them, a tall boy with a scar across his knuckles, filled a bucket with water, flung it with one practiced motion into a stall, and moved on without breaking stride. I tried to copy him. I spilled most of it on my boots. He glanced at me. Not angry, just amused. He didn't say anything, but I felt the message anyway. There's a way we do things here, and you don't know it yet. Hierarchy wasn't written on paper. It was in the way they carried hay one arm or two, how close they stood to the feed room, who got to touch the saddlecloths, who slept near the heat, who didn't, and me. I was bottom rung, straw boy, ghost. The one the horses sniffed, and the others forgot. But the mare, the dapple grey from yesterday, she saw me again that morning. And for now, that was enough. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was a crust of barley bread and a ladle of thin broth left near the hay bins. No one told me it was mine, but no one stopped me either. I sat behind a barrel to eat, not out of fear, just instinct. It was easier to see without being seen. That's something you learn quickly in places where the rules aren't written, only followed. From that corner, I watched. The stable had a rhythm not rushed, not slow, just decided. Buckets clanged, hooves thudded, ropes creaked. The boys barely spoke, but everything got done. Horses didn't wait. They knew the pattern better than I did. One boy, not much older than me, but already with calloused palms and a stare that held no warmth, brushed a chestnut gelding with the kind of care you'd give a sword. Slow, precise, like it mattered. I remember thinking, what did he do to earn that horse, and what would I have to do? The dapple grey mare stood a few stalls down. She wasn't tethered, just standing there, still, as if she'd been carved from moonlight and patience. When I looked her way, she shifted barely, just a turn of the head, an ear flicked back. But it was something. It said, I see you, and in a place where most boys were trying not to be noticed, and most men didn't bother with names, that tiny gesture felt bigger than it had any right to be. I tore off the last piece of bread and set it on the rail near her stall. Not close enough to feed her, just close enough to mean something. She didn't touch it, but she didn't turn away either. In the silence that followed, I started to think maybe this stable was a kind of language, one I hadn't learned yet but wanted to. By mid-morning, the light had turned from grey to gold, spilling across the stable floor like someone laying down a path not for me, but for the horses. It always belonged to them first. I was assigned muck duty again, Same rake, same routine. Only now I knew to walk wide around the bay stallion who snapped when startled, and how to tilt the pitchfork just right, so the straw didn't fall back on my boots. The older boys still didn't speak, but now and then, one would glance my way, not unkind, just measuring, like they were deciding how long I'd last. That was the test. Really, not how fast you worked, not how much you knew, just how long you stayed. There were names carved into the wooden beams near the tack room, faint, overlapping, some old, nearly worn smooth. I ran my fingers over them once, wondering if the boys who wrote them had ever been seen, or if they, too, were ghosts until proven otherwise. That afternoon, while I dumped a cart of soiled hay outside, I heard it again, the low, rolling snort of the dapple grey mare. Not loud, not even meant for me, but I turned anyway. She was looking toward the window, where the sun lit the dust like floating gold. Her ears flicked. Then she blinked, slow and deliberate. In that blink, I found something I couldn't name. Not yet, but it felt like a beginning. Not of a friendship that would take time, but of attention, mutual, quiet attention. And maybe that's how things began in the stable world. Not with handshakes or words, but with the kind of silence that held space instead of shutting you out. That evening, as the light pulled back from the rafters, I didn't carve my name into the wood. Not yet, but I knew where I would. They called him Branne, or at least, that's what I heard in a whisper, not spoken with fondness. But with the caution you might give a loose wheel on a cart. Watch Bran, he doesn't bow. He stood alone in the far stall, larger than the rest, darker too. His coat was a rich, smoky brown, but the light in the stable always made it look black. His eyes were deep, not angry, not wild, just unreadable, like river stones under dark water. I wasn't assigned to him. No one was, not really. The others fed and watered him with long-handled tools. Staying just out of reach, he had thrown a boy once. They said, kicked through a gate. Some claimed he'd never been fully broken. Others said he'd once belonged to a knight who died in battle, and the horse had never let go. None of that mattered to me. I was raking hay near his stall, careful not to glance too long, but I felt him there, still, watching. And then something small happened, the kind of moment only the quiet notice. A fly landed near his eye. He didn't flinch, just turned his head ever so slightly toward me. Not a gesture for help, not a command, just acknowledgement. So I stepped closer, slow as morning light, and lifted the cloth I used to clean saddles. He didn't move. With one soft sweep, I brushed the fly away. Still, he didn't move. The air between us held its breath. For a heartbeat, maybe two, we were just two creatures standing still. No rope, no rule, just presence. I didn't try to touch him again. But when I turned back to my rake, I knew something had shifted, not in Branny. Not yet. In me. After that morning, I didn't speak of Branny. Not to the boys. Not to the steward. Not even to myself. Not aloud. In the stable, some things didn't need to be claimed. If you named it, you risked losing it. If you showed it mattered, someone stronger might take it. So I kept my eyes low, but my ears open. I learned when they fed him second to last. Never first. I learned he didn't like the sound of buckets clanging, but stood calm when you hummed. I didn't mean to find that out. It just happened. One cold morning, when I was wiping down tack and a tune slipped from my throat without thinking, he stilled, turned toward the sound. That was all. But I kept humming. There was something almost human in the way he carried silence, not empty, not distant, but chosen, like he'd once spoken loud and long in some other life, and decided it wasn't worth the cost. That day, I brought him a few extra apple peels left from the kitchen scraps. I didn't feed them by hand. I wasn't foolish, just laid them on the edge of his stall and walked on. Later, when I came back with a fresh rake, they were gone, all but one. One peel left sitting neat in the straw, curled like a question. I didn't know if he'd dropped it or left it, but either way, I took it as a kind of answer. And for the first time since I arrived, I began to feel that maybe this place wasn't about taming wild things. Maybe it was about being quiet enough, long enough, to notice when a wild thing chose not to leave. That evening, after the chores were done, and the light thinned to that soft amber color that only shows up on the backs of horses and old barnwood. I found myself near Bran's stall again. Not by accident, not quite on purpose either, just pulled. He stood the same as always, solid, quiet, untied. He could have turned his back. He didn't. The others were off eating, voices echoing from the yard in a language of elbows and laughter I hadn't learned yet. I stayed behind. Sweeping the corners no one noticed, listening to the scrape of bristle on wood and the hush of Bran's breathing. At one point, I dropped the broom. It hit the floor with a sharp thud. He flinched just a step back, a twitch in the shoulder. But then, he returned, slowly, deliberately. And in that moment, something in my chest settled. Not pride, not victory, just place. There was no petting, no bridling, no clever tricks, just a horse who didn't bow for anyone, but didn't walk away from me. That night, as I lay down again in my corner of straw, the cold still came up through the boards. The blanket still scratched, my hands still ached, but the stable felt smaller somehow. Not in size and loneliness, because somewhere in the dark, one pair of eyes might be open, steady, remembering me the way I remembered them. Bran hadn't bowed. He never would. But in the language of hooves and hush, I'd been heard. And sometimes, when you have nothing else, being heard even once is enough to make you stay. Nights in the stable had their own rhythm, different from the day, softer, deeper, as if the walls exhaled when no one was looking. By now, I'd learnt not to sleep too sound. The hay settled beneath me like an old man's sigh, and the wind had a way of slipping through every board like it was chasing something. It was on one of those half-sleep nights that I heard it. Not words, at first, just the low creak of a saddle being moved, not loudly, not in panic, but with care. The kind of movement that means the hands know exactly where to press and how to lift without noise. I didn't stir. A boy who sleeps too lightly gets questioned. A boy who listens gets noticed. But I let my eyes drift just enough to see through the slats of my stall wall a flicker of shadow near the tack room. 2 figures. No lantern, just the pale glow of moonlight falling like silver dust across their backs. They weren't stealing, not exactly. Nothing left missing in the morning. But they were saying something, just in how they moved, voices lowered, not from fear, but familiarity. I couldn't hear the words, only the sound of stirrups brushing leather, a quiet laugh, a boot tapping gently on wood, and then silence again, the kind that doesn't feel empty, but full of things not meant for daylight. I didn't tell anyone. What was there to say? The stable had rules the kind no one wrote down. One of them was this: at night, let the horses sleep, and let the secrets settle where they fall. And so I turned my head back toward the wall, eyes closed, letting the sounds fade into straw and darkness. And in that moment, I began to understand this place didn't just hold animals. It held people's unspoken selves, too. The next day came as it always did, slow, grey, and smelling of damp wool and oats. No one mentioned the night before. No one ever did. But I noticed small things. The way the older boys nodded to each other. Not in greeting, but in memory. The way one of them lingered just a little longer by the tack room door. How their hands moved a little softer when tightening girths or brushing dust from a saddle. They weren't hiding anything. They weren't proud of it either. It just was, and I think that's when I started to understand what the stable really was. Not just a place to work, but a holding ground for tired feet, for worn leather, for stories too tender for firelight or feast halls. The horses knew it, too. They carried more than bodies. They carried burdens. I saw it in Bran's gait, how he walked heavy one morning. Not from age, but from something passed through the hands that saddled him. I couldn't name it, but I felt it. There were no walls between man and beast here. Not really, just layers of silence. I began watching how the stable master moved. He said little, but his presence was everywhere in the way a stall door was oiled, in how water buckets were filled without ever splashing over. You could feel his care not in orders, but in absence, things done right before anyone needed to ask. He saw everything. I think he saw me, too, but he never said much. That, I was learning, was its own kind of kindness. Not everyone who's silent is ignoring you. Some are simply giving you space to become someone worth listening to. And for now, I still had more listening to do. That evening, I stayed behind after the others had gone off to supper. I told myself I was finishing chores, wiping down the bridles, recoiling lead ropes, rehanging the curry combs. But really, I think I just wanted to hear what the stable sounded like when no one was trying to fill it. The light was soft, the kind that made everything look older and more honest. Dust floated in the beams like memories not quite ready to settle. I walked slowly between the stalls, dragging my fingers across the smooth wood, feeling the dents and scratches each one. I imagined, left by a different day, a different boy, a different story. Bran stirred in his stall but didn't lift his head. The dapple grey mare shifted her weight once, then sighed. That sound, not a whinny, not a breath just that long. Low release, it stayed with me. It was the sound of the day letting go. Near the tack room, I found an old saddle that hadn't been used in a while. Its leather was worn, but well kept, as if someone still cared for it, even if no rider claimed it now. I sat down beside it, not on a bench, just the floor, and I listened. There was no speech, no whispering this time, just the groaning of beams, the rustle of straw, the rhythm of hooves shifting softly in sleep. But in all that stillness, I felt something clear. This place held more than animals and chores. It held secrets too gentle for daylight, moments too fragile for words. It was a cathedral made of breath and hoofbeats, of quiet choices and shared silences. And somewhere in that hush, I found a truth. Some of the most important things in life are never spoken aloud. They're heard in the space between. We knew something was coming before anyone said a word. Not from the trumpets, they hadn't sounded yet. Not from the flags, none had been raised. No, we knew because the stable changed. Straw was replaced more often. Water buckets were checked twice. Saddles that hadn't been touched in months were brought out into the light, wiped down with oiled cloths, their brass fittings polished until they caught the morning like fire. Voices, usually low and flat, now had a kind of edge to them, not fear, but tension, like the air before a storm. They didn't tell us why. They didn't need to. Word traveled the way it always did, through glances, through what wasn't said, and eventually, through the whisper no one quite believed until it came from the steward's own mouth. The Emperor is riding in. No one said Charlemagne. Not yet, as if speaking the name might invite something too large into our small world. But even without the name, we felt it. I was told to help brush down the large Frisians, the ones kept for high ceremony. Their coats were deep black, with manes that shimmered like river water in the sun. They didn't flinch. They'd been through worse than boys with soft hands. I wasn't given a brush, not at first, just a bucket of warm water and a cloth. But that cloth became something sacred in my hand. With it, I wiped sweat and dust from the back of a creature that might soon carry an emperor, and in that quiet task unseen, unpraised, I felt a strange pride rise in my chest. Not for myself, but for the horse, for the moment, for being part of something larger than my name, even if no one ever asked what it was. Before the sun had crested the tree line, the stable already smelled sharper, not of animals, but of polish, starch, and firewood burning fast. The steward walked through the stalls, not with his usual limp, but with a stiffness that said he expected eyes on him. Even the stable master, usually so still, had his sleeves rolled and his brow furrowed in a way I'd never seen. There was no shouting. That would have broken the spell. Instead, orders came like wind through reeds soft, precise, unquestioned. I was placed near the saddle bench, a long wooden rack where the ceremonial gear was laid out like relics in a chapel. There were stirrups engraved with lions, reins braided with gold thread. One saddle, in particular, caught my breath, not for its wealth, but for its wear. Its leather had been mended. Yes, but with care, the edges softened by years. The seat polished smooth, not by cloth, but by years of steady riding. It didn't shine like the others, but it carried weight. This one, the steward said, barely glancing at me, goes on the Emperor's lead. He didn't explain why, but he didn't have to. In that moment, I understood something I couldn't have said before. Even kings don't trust what's new. Not when they ride. They choose what's known. What's been tested. What carries the memory of thousands of miles and doesn't fail. I ran my hand along the saddle's edge. It was warm from the morning sun, but cool underneath, like it remembered both glory and rain. And somehow, being near it made me feel steadier. Not important, not special, just present. Like one note in a song that only worked because every piece was in place, even the quiet ones. By the time the sun reached the loft window, everything was in place. The horses stood ready, manes brushed, hooves oiled, blankets smoothed and embroidered. Even the air felt combed, like it had been told to behave. I wasn't needed anymore, not for the big parts, not for the arrival. The older boys would lead the horses. The steward would bow. The stable master would speak, if spoken to. I would watch from the edge. And that was all right, because while they waited at the front gate, faces stiff with pride and nerves, I lingered behind just long enough to run my fingers once more along that saddle's curve. There was something sacred in that leather, not because a king would sit there, but because someone had sat there before, again and again, through cold, a rain, battle maybe and come back. Not every throne is made of gold. Some are stitched into saddles, quiet, weathered, carried not by servants, but by silence and use. And that morning, as the first distant horns echoed across the fields, not loud, but clear, I didn't cheer. I didn't run forward. I stood beside the stall of the grey mare. She didn't flinch, just turned her head slightly toward the open stable doors, where the sound of hooves would soon arrive, and I whispered, mostly to her, but maybe also to myself, "He's coming." She blinked once, then closed her eyes, as if to say, let him. That moment, not the entrance, not the ceremony, but that whisper between boy and beast. That was when I knew this place belonged not to the emperor, not even to the horses, but to the ones who stayed behind, quietly keeping everything ready, just in case he did. You don't notice it at first how a life takes shape. One morning you fold your blanket a little neater. Another, you learn which bucket creaks and how to avoid the one horse who doesn't like sudden steps. Soon, you find yourself moving without thinking, hands finding the brush before your eyes do, boots stepping around puddles that haven't even formed yet. It doesn't feel like learning. It feels like remembering something your body already knew. That's how it was, weeks after the emperor's visit. The stable didn't go back to normal, because there was no normal. There was only this day, and the one after it, and the one after that, and slowly, without ceremony or announcement, I became part of it. Not important, not praised, just expected. Someone left my share of bread on the barrel each morning. A wooden comb found its way into my straw corner. No one claiming it. Once, an older boy handed me a curry brush without looking, and I realized he hadn't paused because he assumed I'd take it. It was the smallest things that told me I belonged. Not the words, the rhythm, because in a place where everything had its time, when to feed, when to rest, when to say nothing falling into step wasn't a task. It was a kind of welcome. And in that quiet order, I found something no feast, no coin, no father's nod had ever given me, a place that didn't ask who I was before, only who I was willing to be now. There was a boy named Thomas. He didn't speak much. Broad shoulders, always one sleeve rolled up, a scar across the bridge of his nose like a faint, crooked river. He was older than me by at least 3 winters, and he moved like someone who'd been here long enough to forget arriving. He never told me to hurry, never told me I was wrong. But one morning, as I was fumbling with a knot in the hay rope, he walked over without a word, took the line, and showed me once, slow and clean, then handed it back. That was all. And from that day on, if I saw him working a stall, I'd pass him a brush before he asked. He'd refill my bucket when mine was light. We didn't speak. We didn't need to, because in places like the stable, you don't bond over talk. You bond over rhythm. Another boy, Ralph, younger than Thomas but meaner in the eyes, once tossed me a rag after I'd spilled water down my front. I braced for a laugh, or worse, but he only said, "You'll dry," and walked off. In the old world, the world before this place, those words might have stung. Here, they meant something different. You're not new anymore. You've been noticed. The stable had a strange way of welcoming people. It never opened its arms. It just made space around you. Quiet space, steady space. And if you stayed long enough, you learned that was more generous than any greeting ever could be. By the end of that month, I had a rhythm. Mornings began before the rooster, not with a call, just the soft creak of my knees as I stood, the sound of Bran shifting in his stall, the muffled steps of Thomas, already 2 chores ahead. My hands knew which brushes the grey mare preferred. I knew which horses kicked the boards when they were lonely, and which ones only relaxed if you hummed while cleaning their hooves. There was no praise, no raised voices of approval, just the sound of a job done right, a quiet, satisfying absence of mistake. In time, I was trusted with small things, a satchel of oats to measure, a girth strap to check. Once, the stable master pointed toward a colt, fresh from the training fields, and said, "Clean him." Just that. No instruction, no warning. And I did. The colt twitched at first, uncertain, but I held the brush steady, let him smell me, gave him space, like Bran had taught me. Afterward, I stood back and looked at the horse sleek, brushed, calm, not proud of myself, just glad. Because here, usefulness was love, and doing something well, even something small, was how you said, "I'm here, I matter." That night, as I curled into my straw bed and pulled the same old blanket over my shoulder, I didn't feel low or lesser, or waiting for something better to begin. This was the something, a quiet life, measured in hoofbeats, morning light, and the warmth of horses breathing in the dark beside me. He showed up just past sunrise, not from the road, but from behind the grain shed, as if he'd been there all along, waiting for the light. His boots were bent, turned inward like a pair of tired knees. His coat was patched, not sloppily, but with the kind of care that says, "I've had this long enough to need it to last." No one announced him. No trumpets, no whispers. The stable master simply nodded once and pointed toward the corner stall, the one that had stayed empty since spring. I was filling water buckets when I first saw him. He didn't look at me. Not directly, just nodded the way old men do when they aren't sure if you're a boy or a shadow. He carried a saddlebag that jingled faintly, not with coin, but with something softer, tools, maybe, or broken things he hadn't given up on. No one called his name, so I called him the man with the bent boots. He moved slow, but not weak. His hands were thick, fingers curled from age or habit. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice carried the gravel of old road dust and cold mornings. The others didn't treat him like a stranger, more like a returning season, as if he came back every so often, not expected, but never questioned. And me, I watched, because something about him felt familiar, though I knew I'd never seen him before. There was a quiet to him that matched the stable, not silence from distance, but silence from understanding. The kind you don't earn in a week, or even a year, the kind that comes from knowing when to speak, and when to simply sit beside a tired horse and breathe. He didn't claim a space, not the warm corner by the furnace, not the padded bench near the tack room. He just settled into the back stall, where the roof dipped low and the dust hung heavier in the beams. From there, he began to work, not loudly, not in a rush, just one rope at a time, one buckle at a time. He fixed what didn't scream to be fixed, straps that still held but creaked when pulled, bridle loops that frayed at the edges. Even the old grain scoop with a crack near its handle, he wrapped it with waxed cord, tied clean knots, then set it back without a word. He didn't ask permission, he didn't ask anything, but the stable changed around him, almost like the air breathed easier in his presence. I found myself slowing down near his stall, not stopping, just taking my time as I passed, watching his hands move like they remembered every tool before they touched it. Once, he caught me looking. He didn't smile, but he didn't turn away. Instead, he held up a worn leather strap torn through the middle, like a bite had taken it. He said, "Most boys toss it. Think it's done." Then he lifted it to the light and added, "But the thing is, sometimes it just needs a different kind of pressure." That was all. And then he went back to stitching. But those words, they didn't leave me, because in them, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while, maybe ever, that even what's broken can still carry weight, even if no one expects it to, even if it bends. The next morning, I found a small bundle near my corner, not much, just a scrap of oiled cloth tied with twine. Inside was a bone-handled awl, a blunt needle, and 3 strips of leftover leather. No note, no instructions, but I knew where it came from. I didn't thank him. Not because I wasn't grateful, but because in the stable, some gifts were too quiet for thanks. You simply used them. That was how you said I see you. That day, during the midday lull, when even the horses seemed to doze, and the light hung lazy through the rafters. I sat outside Bran's stall and tried threading one of the leather strips. My fingers were clumsy. The needle pricked twice, then slipped. I cursed under my breath, then looked up, and there he was, the man with the bent boots. He didn't speak, just sat beside me with a sigh like settling dust. Then, without a word, he took the strip, showed me the angle not by telling, but by letting me feel the pull in his grip. He guided once, then let go, and I tried again, and this time, the needle held. We worked like that until the shadows stretched long and the grain bins rattled for supper. Before he stood, he looked down at my stitches crooked, but holding, he nodded once and said, "Ugly lasts longer than pretty, if you tie it right." Then he walked back to his stall boots creaking, slow and bent, and I stayed there, holding that stitched strip in my lap, feeling something new in my chest. Not pride, not skill, but a kind of belonging that doesn't ask you to speak, just to stay. The sound of horses breathing. There's a certain hour before dawn when the world holds its breath. Not the breath before a storm, that sharp, anxious kind. No, this is the breath of stillness, of pause, of something ancient stretching slowly beneath the skin of morning. And if you happen to be awake during that hour, not by accident, but by quiet habit, you'd hear things most folks never do. In the stable, it began with the faintest rustle, a shift of straw under hoof, the wooden rafters, groaning not in protest, but in memory, the air itself, cool and weightless, moving between stalls like an old friend passing through. I would lie still, not yet ready to rise, and listen. From Bran's stall came the low, deep exhale of a horse resting with purpose, not from exhaustion, but because he knew the value of silence. From the far end, the grey mare would let out a softer breath, almost musical in how it fluttered near the gate. Each sound had its own shape. A tail flick made a whisper like fabric in wind, the snort of a gelding dreaming something he'd never tell, the steady rhythm of 4 or 5 animals breathing at once, slow, uneven, but oddly in harmony, as if the stable itself had a heartbeat, and I had somehow become part of it. There was no talking in these moments. Even the boys who rose early spoke in glances, because in a place where creatures that big chose stillness, the least you could do was listen. Sometimes I'd slip from my straw bed before the bell rang, not because I had to, and not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because some mornings simply asked for your presence, quietly. Like a hand on your shoulder, I'd move without boots, just cloth-wrapped feet across cold planks, and sit outside Bran's stall with my back against the post and my arms folded over my knees. He always knew I was there, even before I made a sound. He wouldn't rise, wouldn't snort or stamp or turn. He'd just breathe, the kind of breath that began in the lungs, but echoed out into the room, into the straw, into the bones of the place, and I would match him in hold. That's not for practice, not for discipline, but because something inside me needed to be in rhythm with something that wasn't asking anything from me. There was no praise in that, just presence. One morning, I watched a shaft of early light creep across the floor, inching toward the edge of his stall, and just as it reached the line between shadow and sun, he let out a breath so slow, so grounded, that the dust in the air seemed to stop and hover in reverence. And in that breath, I heard something. Not words, no, but a kind of message, the way an old song lives in the strings of an instrument long after the player is gone. It said, "You are not alone here, not if you listen." Later that week, just before the first snow hinted in the air, I was brushing down the grey mare while the others finished their rounds. It was the quiet time between chores and supper. When the stable feels more like a memory than a building, you could hear boots in the courtyard, the creak of harness leather cooling on hooks, the far-off call of a kitchen bell too tired to ring clear. She was calm. The mare, her ears stilled, her eyes half closed as I moved the brush along her side. My thoughts were elsewhere on nothing important. Maybe the smell of stew, maybe how the frost had curled the edge of the straw pile, And then, without warning, she turned her head toward me, not sudden, not frightened, and exhaled. It wasn't a gust. It was a gift. Warm breath on my cheek, soft and slow, like a blessing spoken in a language only the skin understands. I stopped brushing, just stood there, still, eyes closed. And in that moment between her exhale and mine, the barn didn't feel like wood and nails. It felt like shelter from the world, from my own noise, from the ache of trying to be more than just here. So I breathed out too, letting go of whatever it was I didn't know I'd been holding. The mare blinked once, and we stood there, two creatures, not speaking, not needing to, in a cathedral of breath and quiet and dust that only the horses and I seem to recognize as holy. There are days when the sky doesn't fall. Exactly. It just sinks, like someone pressing down on your shoulders, not to hurt you, but to remind you you're still small beneath something much older, much wider than your own thoughts. That morning, the sky was that kind of low, not storm dark, just nearer. The air had changed, too. You couldn't smell it in the straw or the leather, but in the earth itself, in the way the ground held cold longer, in how the breath of the horses came out thicker, hanging in the air a beat too long before fading. I noticed Bran standing different that day, not nervous, not restless, just aware. His ears twitched less, his eyes moved more. He looked, more than usual, toward the open door at the far end of the barn, as if expecting something to come in. Not someone, something, and I understood, because I felt it too. The light didn't reach as far across the floor as it had a week ago. The shadows came sooner, and they came heavier. Even the sounds had changed, the clinking of bit rings, the thud of hooves, the way the crows outside had gone quiet. And in all of that, I noticed my own breath again, not because it fogged more, but because I was holding it more often, catching myself listening for things I couldn't name. And that was the first time I knew, deep down, that the season had turned, not on the calendar, but in us. No one said it aloud, but the boys moved quicker now. They tightened girths with more care, double-checked feed bins, tied knots with fingers red from cold. Even Thomas, who usually stretched mornings like old leather, was already halfway through mucking his second stall before I'd rubbed the sleep from my eyes. Oh, it wasn't fear. It wasn't even urgency. It was instinct, the kind that doesn't rise from orders, but from marrow, the kind that tells you the easy days are ending. Grace, the stable smelled different too. Less sweat, more smoke, the scent of drying oats, old wool, the metal of cold buckets touched before sunrise. The man with the bent boots brought out tools I hadn't seen before, thicker stitching wire, oil for frozen hinges, a heavy apron he only wore when the frost turned stubborn. No one asked why. We just watched and mirrored. I saw the grey mare begin to grow her coat thicker, not overnight, but in that soft, downy way that catches hay and smells faintly like wind. And one evening, as I laid fresh straw in Bran's stall, he turned to me slow, deliberate, and sniffed the back of my hand before lowering his head to the bedding. Not as a sign of approval, more like a ritual, as if to say, this is how we begin again in colder light. I didn't speak. I didn't pet him. I just stood there a while longer than I needed to, letting my breath come and go in visible clouds, as if I, too, was learning how to be in this new quiet, this new weight in the sky, this new season of fewer words, but deeper listening. That night, the barn was quieter than usual, not silent, just subdued, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from absence, but from anticipation, as if the walls themselves were bracing for something they couldn't name. I lay in my straw with the blanket pulled higher than usual, even over the tip of my nose, and watched the beams above. They were darker now, not just from shadow, but from time. A soft wind passed through the loose boards in the eastern wall just enough to lift the edge of my blanket and remind me that nothing in this place stood still forever. I thought, for the first time in weeks, of home, not with longing, not with regret, just wondering if anyone there had noticed the season change the way I had. Did they feel it in their boots, their joints, their breath? Did anyone miss the rhythm of my steps on the floorboards? And if I went back now, would the house feel smaller? Or would I? The mare shifted in her stall. Bran snorted once, low and long, then settled again. Their breath filled the room. Slow, present, and I realized the stable was not colder. I was simply more aware of the warmth it still held. The kind of warmth that doesn't blaze, doesn't call attention, but stays like coals beneath ash, like a voice waiting to be heard. If only you breathe quiet enough to hear it. I close my eyes. Let the cold pass over, and let the breath of the horses anchor me to a place where even the low sky could not press me down too far. The first frost came without warning, like an old friend who shows up unannounced, not to stay, not to disrupt, but just to remind you that time moves. Even when you're not watching, it wasn't the kind of frost that cracked windows or bent trees. No, this was finer, more delicate, the sort of chill that whispered across the fields like lace unraveling at the edge of a sleeve. I woke to a stillness sharper than silence, the kind of stillness where the breath catches not from fear, but from recognition. Something had changed. My blanket, thin as it was, held just enough warmth to make climbing out from under it feel like betrayal. But I rose anyway, stiff-limbed and blinking, and made my way toward the stable door. The boards creaked under my weight, louder than usual, as if the wood itself were shivering. Outside, the sky hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to be day or night, that silver-blue moment where stars haven't vanished, but the sun has begun to insist, and across the yard, every blade of grass, every rail, every stone was dusted with white. Not snow, not yet, just frost, the kind that turns ordinary things into relics. A pitchfork, forgotten near the fence, gleamed like silver. The water trough steamed faintly at the edges. And the horses, oh, the horses, they looked carved from stone, their breath heavy and slow, visible like smoke from an old chimney. Bran stood at the edge of his stall, unmoving, but his eyes were wide, alert, catching the light the way water does before it freezes. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. The world does not fall into winter, it exhales into it, one slow breath at a time. We didn't need to be told what to do. The frost told us. The boys moved quickly but without hurry, as if their muscles remembered what this weather meant. Buckets had to be checked for ice, blankets brought down from the loft, still smelling faintly of cedar and mice. The heavy oil used for hoof cracks was passed around like something sacred. Even the horses knew. They stepped slower, not from pain, but caution. Their hooves struck the frozen ground with a new kind of weight, not loud, just deliberate. I was sent to the back paddock to check the fence lines. The grass crunched beneath my boots with a sound that reminded me of burned paper. Each step left a mark that held its shape longer than it should have. Thomas met me at the corner post. He didn't say hello. He just handed me a length of rope and nodded toward the eastern rail, where something had come loose in the night. We worked in silence, fingers stiff, breath visible between us, two boys, not quite men, but not quite small anymore, bound together by cold air and quiet tasks. When we finished, we stood a moment longer than we needed to. The wind came through the bare trees without rustling them, just a soft brushing sound. Like the pages of a book being turned by an unseen hand. Thomas finally spoke. First frost always feels like a warning. I didn't ask what he meant, because I already knew it wasn't about weather. It was about time, and how winter, the real one, isn't the cold outside. It's the quiet that comes when things stop blooming. That evening, the barn was warmer than I expected. Not by fire, we had none, but by breath and wool and presence. The animals stood closer together, even those that usually kept to themselves. The boys, too, lingered longer in the feed room, their voices lower, their movements slower, as if trying not to wake something sleeping under the floorboards. I sat near Bran's stall with my back against the wall, arms wrapped around my knees. The floor was cold. My fingers ached, but I stayed, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything to begin. I was simply here, present, part of the hush that had settled over the barn like a woolen coat, thick, heavy, comforting. The man with the bent boots passed by me, carrying a lantern whose flame barely flickered. He looked down, then said softly, "Not to me." But maybe not to me either. Frost's not the end of warmth. Boy, just the start of memory. Then he disappeared into shadow. I didn't move for a long while after that, because something about the way he said it soft, certain, like a truth too old to argue settled into my chest. And that night, as the breath of horses rose around me in soft white clouds, I realized I wasn't afraid of the cold. Not really, because when you know how to breathe with the season, even frost can feel like a friend. The letter that wasn't mine. It was during one of those grey afternoons when the frost hadn't lifted, but the light had begun to fade anyway. Not quite evening, not quite day that I found it. I wasn't looking, I was sweeping the loft, more from habit than necessity. The hay up there hadn't been disturbed in weeks, and I think the stable master only asked me to go because he sensed I needed a task that kept me above things for a while. There, between the edge of the roof beam and an old stack of feed sacks, something slipped, not fell, just loosened, a folded piece of parchment, yellowed but not cracked, with one frayed corner and a piece of string looped around it like it had once been tucked into something more important. I don't know why I opened it. It wasn't mine. It didn't have a name, but the air changed when I touched it, like it had been waiting. And what I read wasn't long, just a few lines, written in careful hand. I will come when the frost thaws. Wait for me by the post where we tied the mare. Don't let them sell her. Don't forget the apples. There was no signature, no seal, no date, just those words. Simple, urgent. And suddenly, the barn felt different. Not haunted, but heavier, like it held more stories than the ones we told out loud. I folded the letter back the way I found it, though my fingers lingered longer than needed over the crease. I tucked it into the small pocket inside my tunic, the one I usually use for twine or dried apple slices, and made my way down the ladder slower than I'd climbed it. All that evening, I kept touching the fabric of that pocket, like checking to make sure I hadn't imagined it, but it was there. The words, still warm in my chest somehow. I didn't show it to anyone. Not Thomas, not the stable master, not even the man with the bent boots, though I had an odd feeling he might have known something about it. If I had asked, I didn't. Instead, I started noticing things. The old mare in the far stall, the one no one rode anymore, whose back had grown sway and eyes cloudy. She began to interest me in a way she hadn't before. Was she the one they weren't supposed to sell? The post by the gate, the one with the deep groove near the bottom where a rope had worn through. Was that the one where she'd been tied, and who had waited, who had never come? Or maybe they had come, and it was too late. I began to trace stories from the dust. A boy, maybe older than me, or a girl with strong hands and eyes that memorized hoof patterns. Maybe they were going to run. Maybe they were just hoping to stay. Maybe the apples were for the horse. Maybe they were for goodbye. It didn't matter. What mattered was this. Someone had left behind a promise, and the frost hadn't thawed yet. That night, long after the barn had gone quiet, I lay in my straw, the letter beside me, unfolded. I read it again, though I didn't need to. The words were already written into the space behind my ribs. I whispered them into the dark. Not for memory, for company. Bran shifted in his stall. The grey mare let out a sigh that stirred the edge of my blanket. And still, I didn't sleep, because I was thinking not about who wrote the letter or who they meant it for, but about what it meant to leave behind a hope, even a small one, even one that might never be read. In a place like this, where most things are used up and thrown out: rope, straw, names. Boys, what a strange, tender act it was to write something and leave it, to believe, even for a moment, that someone might come, that someone might care, that someone might keep the mare safe. Just because they were asked, I didn't know if I was meant to find it, but I did, and now that I had, I couldn't forget it. So I tucked it back into my tunic, curled tighter under my blanket, and told myself, not as a plan, but as a promise, I won't let them sell her. I didn't know if anyone still remembered, but I would, because even in a place built on silence, sometimes a forgotten letter is the loudest thing in the room. A name for the quiet mare. She stood in the back stall, not quite in shadow, but certainly far from attention, the kind of place reserved for those not needed often, but not quite forgotten. Her feed was measured like the others. Her straw was changed, but no one touched her more than required. No one brushed the long hairs beneath her chin. No one called her anything. I hadn't noticed that before. Or maybe I had and just didn't know what it meant. But after the letter, everything shifted. I started stopping by her stall each morning, just briefly, just enough to place a palm near her shoulder, not touching, waiting. She didn't move at first, didn't shy, didn't lean in. She simply stood, still and waiting, like someone used to being passed by. But I noticed things, the way her ears twitched when the younger colts neighed too loud, the way she stepped around a puddle, never through, how her breath left her mouth in shorter bursts than Bran's, not from fear, just from age. And slowly, I began to understand her rhythm, not through work, through watching. I asked the stable master once if she had a name. He grunted, rubbed his beard, then said, "Been here longer than I have. Maybe she had one. Doesn't answer to any now." And that was that, but it didn't sit right. Everything in that barn had a name. Even the mouse that lived under the feed room was called Two Toes by the boys, but not her. So I began to call her something not aloud, not yet, just in my mind. When I brought her fresh hay or cleared the cobwebs from her gate, I tried a few, old words from home, ones I'd heard in lullabies, names from dreams I didn't tell anyone about, but none of them fit. Not until one morning, when the frost was thick enough to sketch lace across the stall walls, and she turned her head slow, deliberate, and looked at me, not past me, at me, and I felt something settle into place, like a breath you didn't know you were holding, finally released. I whispered the name then, softly, into the straw, Thimble. I don't know why, but it felt right. Small, steady, something used to mend things, to protect the fragile, something old, but never useless. And even though she didn't flick an ear or blink in surprise, she stood still just a second longer than usual, and I took that as enough. From that day forward, I said it aloud, not always, not when others were near, but when I brushed her mane, when I left an apple core near her gate, when I passed her at dusk and the barn light hit her grey coat just right. Thimble, I'd say, like greeting an old friend returning without fanfare. And little by little, she changed, not in size, not in strength, but in presence. She stepped closer to the gate when I approached. She took oats from my hand, not greedily, but without doubt. Once, when the wind howled and rattled the roof, I found her standing near the boards where I always sat, as if to say, "I remember you're here, too." And I kept the letter, folded flat, tucked in the corner of my bedroll. Not because I believed the writer would return, but because I believed someone had loved her once. And now somehow that love had traveled forward. Not through time, through me. So I held it, not like a secret, like a thread, connecting one quiet soul to another, one nameless Mare, to a boy who'd never been called Keeper before. And even if no one else ever used the name, even if the frost stayed longer than it should have, even if spring forgot to return, she was Thimble, because sometimes a name doesn't change the world. It simply reminds it that someone was worth calling when no one was watching. It began with the latch, just a crooked hinge on the rear gate that always groaned a little louder than the others, the kind of sound you don't think much of until it's absent. I noticed it one morning when the wind had already stripped the last leaves from the stable yard elm, and the water in the troughs froze in strange, lacy patterns that looked like they might hold secrets. The latch didn't groan. It wasn't open, but it had been moved, shifted just enough that I knew it wasn't the wind. Still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because sometimes, when the world has finally settled into a rhythm that feels like safety, even the smallest disruption feels like a threat too soft to name. Later that day, Thomas mentioned a missing curry comb. No alarm in his voice. No accusation. Just that mild frustration of a tool misplaced something too familiar to make a fuss over. But then Ralph couldn't find the saddle blanket he'd laid out that morning, and one of the younger boys swore his knife, the one from his uncle, had gone missing from the ledge above his bedroll. Again, no shouting, no searching. Just frowns, shrugs. That unease you try to brush off by working harder, but unease doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It burrows and waits. I kept watch after that. Not by order, not even consciously. At first, but something in me had learned, maybe from the horses, maybe from the frost, that when silence grows too thick in a place meant for movement, something has shifted. That night, I stayed up longer than usual, my blanket pulled only halfway. My ears tuned not to the breathing of the horses, but to the spaces between them, and just past midnight when the air had turned sharp enough to sting the lungs, I heard it. Not a voice, not a footstep, just the quiet squeal of that same gate latch, followed by a pause. Then soft movement. I rose without noise, stepping around the edge of Bran's stall with care, keeping to the beam-shadowed line along the wall where moonlight didn't reach. There was a shape, not large, not small, just someone who knew where the saddle oil was kept, someone who moved like they belonged but too lightly, too carefully. I didn't call out, didn't chase, because something inside me, something slow and sad, already knew what this was. And I didn't want to watch trust shatter in front of me, so I waited until they left, slipping through the side door like a breath no one meant to exhale. Then I went to Thimble's stall. She was still there, standing, watching, her ears turned back, not in fear but in knowing, and I whispered her name, not for her, but for me, because in that moment, I needed something to still be true. The next day, the boys moved slower. No one said why, but we all knew. Thomas checked the tack room twice. Ralph locked the feed bin, even though no one had ever locked it before, and the man with the bent boots stood at the barn door longer than usual, lantern in hand, eyes not squinting from light. But from memory, no one accused anyone, no one pointed fingers. But the air had changed. We cleaned stalls as usual, brushed coats, measured grain, but there was a pause in our motions, a silent counting between tasks, as if each of us was waiting to see if anything else had gone missing. And it had. Not things, but something else. The feeling of easy belonging. The quiet that used to soothe now seemed to press. The walls didn't echo warmth. They held their breath. That night, I took the letter from my tunic, unfolded it, and read the words again. I will come when the frost thaws. But maybe some promises don't wait for spring. Maybe they leave in the night, silent as a footstep, soft as a gate unlatching. And all you can do is stay behind. Still brushing the mare, no one names. Still whispering into the straw. Still choosing to believe in quiet, even when it doesn't answer back. Because sometimes, when no one is watching, is exactly when you decide who you are. The night of silent hooves. The rain came slow at first, like someone's quiet breathing in the dark, but by midnight it had shifted an urgent tapping against the roof, telling secrets that the stable sleeps in new rhythms when the sky opens. I was lying awake anyway. The letter folded beside me, tangled in thoughts of trust and frost and things that walked out of barns in the night. I heard it before I saw it, the soft, uneven thud of hoof against wood, a sound too large to be a mouse, too small to be a horse fully grown. I rose before thinking, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders, and slipped out into the damp night. Boots squelching in the dark straw, breaths curling in front of me like questions. The barn door wasn't locked. No need when thieves steal silence. Not things, but the gap was just wide enough to let in a shape. She was wet and impossible in the moonlight, sleek grey coat dripping like mist. Thimble didn't move, but I sensed her alert, ears flicked forward and nostrils flaring in disbelief. And then I understood. It wasn't Thimble who had come in. Another mare, wild and unknown, had slipped into our quiet place. Her eyes were wide, not wild, but wary. She stamped once, though softly, as if marking the ground to remind herself where she wasn't supposed to be. The rain spattered her back with tiny drum beats, and her breath came in short gasps, clouds fading into shadows, none of us breath. Rain, me, or she spoke, but I heard enough. She needed something. Shelter, maybe forgiveness for trespassing, maybe just someone to hold out a hand or take a step back. I stood there, still, not sure if I should close the door or ask her to come closer, or just breathe and see what night would show. So I stayed, and the rain tapped, and the hooves listened. Minutes passed as if hours. The barn shifted, settling around us, awaking to its purpose, not as a prison, but as a promise. Here, you can breathe. I stepped back, flicking the latch closed, though softly, and leaned against the door. The rain had pooled around my boots. My blanket was soaked to misery, but I didn't move. Then, in the shadows behind me, I heard the barn door open. Thomas, Ralph, the man with the bent boots. They came not with torches, but with quiet steps, choir of gentle concern. Aware but not alarmed. They didn't question. They just stood. And the mare, she lowered her head slowly, as if bowing to a gathering she never invited, but did not refuse. When Thomas held out his hand, she nickered, low and soft, and in that moment, the barn exhaled relief. It hadn't known it could hold. We brought her inside further, placing hay near her feet, murmuring names we thought hearing might help, not loud, just offerings into the dark stillness. I thought of the letter, promises, frost, the name Thimble, and how sometimes what is abandoned finds its way back, not because it wants to return, but because something in the place still remembers. We stayed until the rain eased, hands gentle but sure, checking hooves, brushing soggy coat, noticing welts or cuts. The man with bent boots wrapped a wool blanket around her again, not warmth to fix her, but kindness in knowing she needed it. When it ended, she didn't run off. She stood beside Thimble, 2 grey mares in low light, 2 breaths among many, both strangers and kin. The next morning, the stable was quiet in a different way, not because nothing changed, but because everything had. The rain had wiped the yard clean, each puddle reflecting a sky uncertain of what it had done. The fence was dented where she'd nudged it. The trough had cracked ice, and 2 mares stood side by side, silent witnesses to a night none of us spoke about in mourning. I found a half footprint in the mud at the door, deep and earth-marked. I knelt, tracing its curve with my fingertip. A wild hoof, a reminder that kindness can cross boundaries we never drew. Thimble nuzzled the new mare, her presence not ownership, but acknowledgement. I stepped closer, offering grain in both hands, and when the stranger nipped gently, I understood. She wasn't lost. She'd found something worth trusting. Thomas came then, carrying warm water. She didn't bolt this morning, he said quietly. No relief needed, just a note of wonder. Ralph brought our blankets. The man with bent boots placed his hand on the new mare's neck as if in quiet ceremony. And I whispered, "You're safe here." The mare's eyes softened. Not relief, exactly, but permission to stay, even as winter approached. That day, the stable moved differently. Tools were sharper, voices quieter, grips softer. No one asked whose mare she was. No announcements. Yet in that simple silence, we all knew, home isn't a name. It's the breath beside you when the night is long and strange. The hoof step that says you belonged all along. The place that held space for something without reason. And maybe, just maybe, that is what love becomes. 2 mares, 1 barn, and a night of silent hooves that changed everything. The blanket trade, the cold deepened that week. Not with storm or snow, but with that particular kind of chill that settles into your joints before you admit it's winter. It seeped through wood and wool. It lived in the cracks of the stable floor and curled beneath the sleeves of even the thickest tunics. Breath no longer floated, it hovered, suspended in the quiet, like it feared to land. We were each given 1 blanket, thick, coarse, smelling faintly of smoke and straw. A gift of sorts from the castle stores, or perhaps from old stock traded in bulk. It didn't matter. What mattered was that when the wind howled, that blanket felt like a wall between you and forgetting what warmth was. Most boys clutched theirs even in daylight, wrapping it tight around their shoulders when the chores were done. Some folded it beneath their straw to soften the night. But I couldn't, not after what I saw. The new mare, no one had dared name her yet, as if giving her a name meant she might vanish, had begun to tremble in the late hours. Not violently, just in that way where you could see her muscles ripple under skin, like wind rippling under canvas. We'd moved her stall closer to Thimble's. She ate, drank, stood, even nickered now and then. But the cold, it clung to her like memory, and I knew without anyone saying that she needed more than oats and calm voices. She needed a blanket. I waited until the others slept. It wasn't secrecy, exactly, just quiet. I folded my blanket not hastily, but carefully, like something sacred, and stepped lightly across the frost-laced boards. Each step echoing in my ribs more than in the room. Thimble stirred as I passed, a soft sound, not alarmed, just aware. The new mare lifted her head, ears twitching. I didn't speak. Words had no weight here. I unlatched her gate, stepped in, and gently laid the blanket across her back. She flinched once, just the smallest startle, then stood still as stone. Her eyes didn't close, but they softened. I fastened the corners as best I could. The blanket wasn't made for horses, but comfort doesn't ask for precision, only intention. She breathed deeply once, and I matched it. In, out. I stayed with her a few minutes longer, hands at her shoulder, forehead against her neck. Not for warmth, for knowing, because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before, that care doesn't have to be loud, or clever, or approved. Sometimes, it's just a blanket in the night, given without witness, accepted without noise. I returned to my bedroll with only my tunic and a handful of straw beneath me. Sleep didn't come easy. The cold crept in, slow and unapologetic, pressing against my back like a hand that didn't know its own strength. But I didn't regret it, because when morning came and the sun spilled in with that low golden light only found in frost-heavy stables, I saw her, the mare, still wrapped in the blanket, still standing, still here. And something in me stood taller too. No one asked where my blanket went, but Thomas passed me a steaming cup at breakfast without a word. And the man with bent boots handed me a second pair of socks that just happened to fit. Even Thimble brushed her nose against my sleeve in a way she hadn't before. Slow, deliberate, present. The trade was never spoken of, but the warmth spread, quietly, like a story you don't tell, but live. That day, I learned you can give something up without losing. You can be cold and still be held. And sometimes, the smallest gesture folded in silence, offered without price, is what turns a stranger into someone who stays. The man who fixed saddles. He was always just there, never in the way, never drawing notice, more like a beam than a man. Part of the stable, solid, weather-worn, easy to lean on if you knew how. They called him Bend Boots, though I later learned his name was Marden. No one really called him that. He didn't seem to mind. He didn't speak unless spoken to. And even then, his words came slow and short, as if each one cost him something he could not afford to waste. But his hands, they moved like memory. I'd watched him for weeks, never quite close, never too far. He worked with leather the way some folks worked with bread dough or firewood, like it was something living. He could pull a ripped saddle apart and rebuild it without drawings, without talk. Just the low murmur of thread pulled tight, of beeswax warming in his palm, of iron buckles turning smooth again. One morning, after feeding the mares, I lingered. He was sewing the edge of an old bridle, the kind no one used anymore but wouldn't throw away. "Why fix something no one wears?" I asked. He didn't answer for a while. Then, because something once trusted it, and he kept stitching. That answer sat with me for days, long after I'd cleaned hooves, carried water, and rubbed frost from the rails. Because something once trusted it, it echoed louder each time I brushed Thimble, or laid oats for the nameless mare now sleeping sounder in the stall next door. So the next time he was there, trimming worn leather straps by the stove, I asked if I could help. He looked at me not with surprise, but with that quiet, assessing stillness you feel from horses more than men. Then he handed me a piece of cracked saddlebag and nodded toward a spool of thread. And that's how it began. I sat beside him as he worked, awkward at first, too tight with the needle, pricking my finger twice before I learned the rhythm. But he never scolded, never corrected, just let me try, and fixed it later in silence. He'd say little things, not as lessons, just like sharing weather. Don't pull to make it tight, pull to make it last. Or, if it squeaks when it bends, it's asking for oil. Or once, after I fumbled a loop, a stitch knows when you're rushing, and somehow, those words didn't just fix saddles. They fixed something else, too. Something in me that had been waiting to be held steady. One afternoon, while the sun slanted gold through the stable rafters, and the frost was finally loosening its grip, I watched him unwrap an old split stirrup. The leather was nearly useless, cracked, faded, and torn in the middle like a dried leaf. "Can't fix that," I said, not meaning to sound certain. He didn't look up, just said, "You don't fix it for riding." Then after a pause, "You fix it so the next boy knows someone tried." I said nothing. Because what do you say to a truth like that? That evening, I brought him the letter. I didn't explain it, just handed it over, folded and warm from my tunic. He read it once, slow, then folded it again, not sharply, but with care. He didn't ask where I found it. He just looked at me and said, "Then we keep her." Not meaning the paper, not even meaning the mare. I think he meant the promise that some things, people, animals, words weren't meant to be thrown out just because the world forgot their use. And in that dim corner of the stable, with tools that smelled of pine tar and old stories, I finally understood. Some hands don't fix leather. They hold history together, one stitch at a time. A stitch between then and now. It was strange, at first, how things kept going. After the frost, after the letter, after the mare arrived and the blanket disappeared, after the night someone left and never came back, life somehow didn't stop. Buckets still needed filling, hay still needed lifting. Hooves didn't clean themselves, but something in me had shifted. Not like a turning page, but like ink slowly spreading through fabric. The days no longer felt like they belonged only to chores. They belonged to something I hadn't named yet. Each morning, I stopped by Thimble's stall first. She'd greet me now, not with noise, but with stillness that expected me. The other mare, we'd started calling her Flicker, because of the way her ears twitched like candlelight followed Thimble's rhythm, and slowly, mine too. One day, as I brushed their coats side by side, I noticed the crack in the far wall again, the one I used to sit against. It had widened a little from the freeze, but instead of worrying, I traced it with my thumb. And I thought maybe not all cracks are signs of breaking. Some are just places where light finds a way in. Thomas said I'd changed. Not like an insult, more like weather commentary. "You talk less," he said, rubbing his palms together. "But somehow we know more what you mean." I smiled but didn't answer, because maybe he was right. I'd started watching more the way Bran paused before stepping, how Flicker would nudge the trough twice before drinking, how the stable door clicked different depending on who opened it. It was as if the barn had begun speaking in its own slow language, and I was just now becoming fluent. One afternoon, I found Marden, the man with bent boots, placing a new leather halter on the wall. He turned to me and said, "This one's yours." I stared, not in disbelief, but in that way you do when someone gives you something you didn't realize you were ready to hold. "It's for Thimble," he said, "or whichever you're walking. But I'm just..." "No," he interrupted. Soft but firm. "You're not just anything anymore." Then he walked off, left me standing there, fingers on the halter, breath caught in my chest, like a note not yet played. And in that moment, I understood something. You don't become important by being noticed. You become important by noticing. That evening, as twilight draped itself over the stable like an old coat, I led Thimble to the edge of the pasture, just to walk, just to breathe. She was slow, steady, her hooves making soft dents in the thawing ground. Flicker followed, not tethered, just willing. I didn't talk, didn't need to. The birds were quieter now, not gone, just less urgent. And in that hush, I thought of the letter again, not as mystery, but as memory someone had left behind, like a lantern flickering low but still burning. And I realized maybe that's what I'd become. Not the boy who found the letter, but the one who kept it lit, not by solving it, but by letting it live, in Thimble's care, in Flicker's rest, in the quiet between my footsteps and the earth. And so I walked, one hand grazing her side, the other holding nothing. Because sometimes, what you carry doesn't need hands. It just needs to be felt, again and again, like a thread stitched between then and now. And that, I thought, might be the truest kind of belonging there is. The gate that stayed open. It wasn't locked. That was the first thing I noticed. Not broken, not ajar, just open. The small back gate by the far paddock, the one with the latch that always groaned in protest, had been left wide, as if someone had passed through and forgotten, or perhaps remembered too much. There'd been no footprints this time, no stolen tools, no missing oats or shadowy figures, just air, cool, clean, and still tinged with the sweetness of thawing grass. I should have closed it. I know, that was the rule. Always latch the gate, always keep the horses in, always protect the perimeter. But something in me paused. because this time, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like an invitation. Thimble stood nearby, her ears twitching but her body relaxed. Flicker paced once toward the threshold, then returned to her stall, not because she feared the open gate, but because she didn't need it. And me, I stepped to the edge and looked beyond, not at a road, not at a forest, just an old field, and a hill beyond it, and the kind of sky that only arrives after months of holding its breath. And I thought, maybe this gate isn't for leaving. Maybe it's for remembering I stood there for what might have been minutes or hours, long enough for the wind to shift, for the smell of new earth to rise, for the barn behind me to settle again into its quiet rhythm. And as I stood, I thought of all the other gates in my life, the ones I hadn't seen when they were open, the ones I'd rushed to close out of fear, the ones I'd only remembered once they were locked tight and the key gone missing. This one was different, because I was different. A boy who once swept straw just to be useful, now held leather halters without being told. A boy who once shivered alone, now brushed down 2 mares, who knew his voice before his footsteps. A boy who once tried not to be noticed now was trusted, not in grand declarations, not in titles, but in small, steady things. Like being the one who didn't rush to close a gate, who waited instead to see what the day might bring. Eventually, I did close it, not with force, not out of duty, but with the gentleness of someone who knows that safety and freedom don't always disagree. The latch groaned that same low, familiar complaint, and I smiled, because some sounds become companions. I turned back toward the barn, where Flicker had lain down in the straw for the first time since she arrived. Thimble stood watch, her neck arched toward the morning light. Inside, the tools were arranged without labels. The feed scoops leaned against the wall just so, and the halter Marden had given me hung above my bedroll, worn now with use, but still strong. And I knew there would be other gates, other nights when things go missing, other letters that never find their reader. But not all open doors are signs of escape. Sometimes they're reminders that someone once waited there and someone else still does. The wind had quieted by then, not stopped, just softened the way a song fades without finishing. Not because it's forgotten, but because it's being remembered elsewhere. The barn creaked the way old things do not in protest, but in rhythm, the kind of creaking that sounds almost like breathing if you listen long enough, if you're still enough. And I was still, wrapped in my thinner blanket, near the warm stall wall, listening to Flicker shift in her sleep, and Thimble's tail gently sweep the straw. The lantern had gone out hours ago, but a small beeswax stub one Marden had tucked onto my ledge weeks earlier still burned slow. Just a stub, barely flame, but it stayed, and as I watched it tremble, I remembered the first time I stepped into this place, just a boy with frostbitten fingers and too few words. I remembered how I tried to stay invisible, how I swept faster than needed, how I never asked names, how I flinched at raised voices, even if they weren't meant for me. I remembered the letter, the mare with no name, the quiet trade of one blanket for another kind of warmth, and I realized the story hadn't ended. It had simply settled, like ash after fire, like snow after wind, like a candle still flickering, long after the room has gone quiet. The final pause. Outside, someone laughed far off, not sharp a sound carried through pine and distance. Inside, I leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed, and whispered the name one more time. Thimble. No one answered, but I didn't need them to. Some names don't echo, they rest. Some promises don't need witnesses, just keepers. And some stories, the ones whispered into straw, folded into tunics, stitched into halters, don't end. They flicker, they warm, they wait, and maybe they're waiting for you too. You've just listened to The Candle, still flickering a quiet journey through forgotten names, steady hooves, and the soft places history keeps tucked away. If this story brought you calm, or reminded you of someone who once whispered into the dark beside you, leave a candle emoji in the comments. And until next time, stay warm, stay kind, and listen for the sounds the quiet tries to keep. Good night.